If you're born in India, you're probably a Hindu. If you're born in America, you're probably a Christian. If you're born in Pakistan, you're probably a Muslim. That's a coincidence, isn't it? That you're always born into the right God. Always, isn't that lucky? I was born into the right God. All those others are going to hell, but I was born into the right religion. I'm going to heaven.
For people who say we ought not be involved politically, we just ought to preach the gospel, I always say, guess what? Your ability to preach the gospel legally is based on politics.
One of the signs that the second coming is that the stars will fall out of the sky and land on earth. So to even write that means you don't know what those things are. You have no concept of what the actual universe is.
You can separate God from religion, which is what I do. I believe in God. I believe in me. Same person.
All right, welcome to Chaparral. So that's going to become an interesting series, huh? So we kind of finished kind of a fun series, and now we're going to kind of a little more serious series, looking at some hard questions. And when you hear those statements that you just heard, I mean, some of them are hard to deal with. They're hard for us to think through some of those things we just heard, aren't they? Sometimes we don't know how to react. We maybe feel we're being belittled. We may feel we're being talked down to. We feel inadequate sometimes. We don't have the answers to stuff like these kinds of questions or what to say. And sometimes that causes us to react in different ways. One of the ways that we sometimes react, and this is our fault, is to just shut down. We hear a statement that we disagree with or we don't know what to do with, and we kind of just ignore it. We go home and we turn on Netflix and binge watch The Office or something like that. We just kind of don't think about it. And that's not a good thing. Sometimes we're not sure how to react or respond, and so we want to hit, please stand by. Just whoa, stop. But we feel pressured to respond. We feel pressured to say something, but we don't have anything to say. We don't know what to say, and we feel inadequate. When the best thing we can do, the wisest thing, the courageous thing, is to say, please stand by. Let me think about that. Let me figure that out. Let me explore that a little bit. A third way that we respond or respond to us is, this is the one that I think happens way too often, and that is, it's a setup. The way the question is asked or the statement is made is in such a way that limits our responses. We're kind of stuck in how to respond because it's limited the ways that we can respond to that. For example, you ever heard this? Do you believe or do you trust in God or science? Well, who made it an either-or kind of proposition? Or who said it's one or the other? Because if you think about it, if God made the universe and created everything, then maybe science can tell us a little bit about how that all works. That's a good thing. If it's observing the created order, then maybe science can teach us a little bit about the Creator. At the same time, if God created the earth and everything in it, and the universe, then maybe the Creator has something to say about why He made these things and how He made these things. So maybe those two can have a good conversation and learn from each other. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Or like we just saw on the bumper video, right? So when Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the stars falling from heaven in Revelation, I mean, does he not understand what literature is? That sometimes literature speaks in metaphor? Or is he just assuming that the people who wrote these words weren't smart? Here's the thing, I have seen in Jerusalem stones so big that our cranes today can't lift them. Our engineers today can't figure out how they got these huge mammoth limestones up 60, 70, 80 feet in the air. How they did that. We don't know how they did it. We can't do it today. Or their language for the ancients. If you go back and study ancient languages like Latin or Sanskrit, you'll find out that their languages are much more complex than ours are, y'all. They're much more difficult. So they weren't dumb people. Or maybe when you heard Ricky Gervais, the comedian, talk about being in the religion you're kind of born into. That's a pretty broad brush to stroke with, right? That's kind of a big thing to say. Because the reality is Christianity, when it started, was new everywhere it landed. And despite persecution, language barriers, geographical barriers, cultural barriers, despite all of that, Christianity spread from the time of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection to the entire Mediterranean region in under 25 years. Not by being born into it, but by people who chose to follow, who had the courage and the faith to follow Jesus and share that message. Or even the one in the middle you saw about freedom of speech. And look, I so appreciate the Constitution and our right as Americans to have freedom of speech, to say what we want to say. So value that. But is our freedom to speak about Jesus granted to us by the Constitution? No. Jesus gave us that right. When he rose from the dead, he said, "You are now free. You're free to teach and to speak about me and to tell your story and to tell my story. And not even death can stop you." There's no reason to be afraid. And Jesus himself gave us that right, and martyrs throughout the church history have proven that again and again and again. So my point is, you look at some of these questions and statements we see in our culture today, there are often many more layers to it, and it's a good thing for us every once in a while to stop and say, stand by, I need to think about that. And we're going to do that over the next few weeks. Just respectfully stop and have a conversation. Not confrontation, not confusion, just a conversation over some of these issues that are alive and well in our cultures today. Just have a chance to talk about them. But there's one ground rule before we get started, one big thing I want to say before we started, and that's this. It's in 1 Peter 3. It says, "Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you." So always be ready to defend your faith. Yet, he says, do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear so that when you're maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. He's saying, look, it's important to have an answer. It is. To think about things, to understand things, it's important. You can't just ignore it and watch Netflix. But what he does also say is it's critically important how you do that. With what? Gentleness and respect. We are called not just to be right, but to be righteous. In fact, I think it's more important to be righteous than to be right. I think God cares a lot more about the relationships we encounter than the arguments we win. The relationships we encounter more than the arguments that we win. And so we're going to talk about these things with gentleness and reverence and respect with each other. Because here's the thing, people are watching you and me. Your friends, your family, your coworkers, folks at the gym, they're watching how you behave. They want to see if that hope in you plays out in the way you have these conversations. When they ask you a question or say something, how do you respond? Not just what you say, but how you say it. Is it with gentleness and respect? Is it a conversation or a conversation? Or a confrontation? You trying to beat them over the head with the Bible or trying to learn and to teach with respect and gentleness? And so we're going to do that. Now, to do that, we're going to take a look at the longest miracle story in the Bible today. The longest miracle story is in the Gospel of John, chapter 9. It's almost the entire chapter. And what's interesting about this miracle story, it's more than just simply Jesus healing this guy. There's a story that gets to the very heart of what we're talking about today and tells us this has been going on for thousands of years. So turn with me, if you're with John chapter 9. You can follow along on the screens behind me or on your phones. It says this: as Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he is born blind?" This is the exact same kind of question I've just been talking about. Right? The disciples give him two options. Because we know there's only two options. This guy is blind because either A, he sinned, or B, his parents sinned. There is no C, D, E, F, G, or check other options. Just these two. So it's kind of a loaded question. They see this as a cause and effect kind of thing. Which, by the way, is there a better question they could have asked? Absolutely. How about asking, hey, how can we help? Hey, is there a way that we can help this guy's situation be better? Jesus, can you heal him? They don't ask those questions. What they ask is, how? Why? Why was this man born blind? Did he sin or did somebody else? And to be honest, sometimes we do the same thing. We see a situation and we ask, well, how did that happen? How did they get in that position? You ever been driving along and come to an intersection, there's someone there with a sign, holding the sign up, looking for help? Do you ask yourself, I wonder how he got there? Was it his fault or someone else's? We kind of begin to make these assumptions about people. That person was fired. Why? What did they do? And so when we take a look at the disciples here, we kind of have to wonder, why are they asking this question? I mean, are they asking it because maybe they want to be off the hook? Like if this guy sinned and that's why he's blind, then it's on him. And so he's got to kind of, clean up his own mess. And so therefore I don't have to help because it's his own problem. So I'll just leave him alone. Is that why they ask? Or is it because maybe they want to avoid the problem for themselves? If I know why this happened to this guy, I cannot have it happen to me or the people I love. Which are both, by the way, selfish questions too. So they ask, did he sin or did his parents sin? And then Jesus gives option C, which is super uncomfortable. He says in verse 3, Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. So A and B are wrong. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Now that, I don't know about you, but that makes me super uncomfortable. This man was born blind so that God's works could be revealed in him. That means he was born into darkness. He was born without seeing a sunrise or a sunset. He was born, we'll find out later, and was be forced to beg because he's blind. All of that, why? So that God's works could be revealed in him? Isn't there a better way than a lifetime of isolation and suffering? In fact, if you think about this, the disciples had to have been a little bit distressed. Because why are they following Jesus around? Because they believe Jesus is revealing God's works, right? They see that Jesus is doing these things and healing people and teaching and all this great stuff, walking on water. They see Jesus revealing God's works, and they're right there. And so now, does that mean if we're going to be part of revealing God's works, that we're going to suffer? Is that what that means? Well, the short answer here is yes. So they had to have a hard time hearing this as well. Then in verse 6, when Jesus had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes. Which, by the way, you're thinking, is there a better way to heal this guy than like spit pies? But just making spit mud pies was okay back in the first century, but Jesus makes these spitty mud pies. And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And he went and washed and came back able to see. And Jesus is gone. So he just comes back into town and he can see. And people see this guy like, wait a minute. Is that the guy that was over there begging before that was blind? Is that him? No, that's not him. That guy was blind. Some people say, no, that's not the guy. No, wait a minute, hold on. It looks like the guy, but it's not the guy. And there's kind of this debate. And you kind of begin a little bit of an inside picture into how the people in his town saw him. What was he? He was background noise. Right? He was the guy you walked by and didn't really pay attention to. He's the guy on the street corner with the sign that you're like, yeah, whatever, and keep on driving. He's that guy. And no one seems to know what to do with this guy. They just kind of Is it him? Is it not him? And he keeps on saying in verse 9, I'm the guy. Like, are you the guy? Yeah, I'm the guy. I was blind. Now I can see. I'm the guy. But they kept asking him, then how are your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, well, where is he? He said, I don't know. Jesus is gone, right? He's not around. Now, here's the interesting thing. First, they don't really recognize him. And now, do they care that he can see? Is anybody saying, hey, dude, that's awesome. Congratulations, you can see. God, God bless you. That's awesome that God did this miracle in your life. This is fantastic. No one's saying that. Well, how'd this happen? Like, they kind of ignore the person. We want to get to what happened. And where's this Jesus guy? They're not really concerned about him. Never have been. And then the real agendas come to the surface. For some reason, they decide to take this man who'd been born blind, now can see, which, by the way, he has no name in this story, which is too bad. So let's call him Fred. Is that cool? He's just Fred, the blind guy Fred. Okay, so they take Fred to go see the religious leaders for some reason. We're not sure why, but they do. It says in verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees Fred, the man who had been born blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put mud on my eyes, then I washed, now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Now, the guy answers the question, doesn't embellish, just says, hey, look, this is what happened. I'm just telling my story. Nothing complicated, no judgment, just he told me to do these things, I went and did these things. Are they happy for him? No. They want to get down to their questions, which is, how'd this happen? Well, it happened by making some mud and rubbing my eyes on the Sabbath. Oh, on the Sabbath. Well, that doesn't fit our agenda. That doesn't fit our box. Therefore, we know that God doesn't cure on the Sabbath. We know that God does not cure anybody on the Sabbath. God does not work on the Sabbath. Therefore, this Jesus is not from God because he did it on the Sabbath. You with me? We know that God does not heal on the Sabbath. Well, someone should have told God because he did. But they have this set of agendas, these set of questions, these statements that they've got locked in their minds, and they're ignoring the reality in front of them. Now, others have a different perspective. Verse 16, others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. This is exactly what happens today. No different. People see the exact same evidence, the exact same stuff, the exact same thing in front of them, and they have different perspectives on it, and will argue about it and not listen, not learn. They're locked in, and they're divided. Some say, nope, if he cured on Sabbath, he is not from God, he's a sinner. Well, look, the guy can see. What do you think about that? And it says here, they were divided. So they pull in Fred. They say again to the blind man, what do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And he said, he's a prophet. Now again, he doesn't understand everything, does he? He doesn't know about Jesus and Messiah and Son of God, all that stuff. He may know about those things, but he doesn't associate them with Jesus yet. All he knows is that he was blind, and now he can see, and only God can do those kind of things. And this guy did those things, so this guy must be from God. That's all he says. That's all he knows. Doesn't argue, doesn't take sides, doesn't get angry. He just tells a story. But that doesn't fit the agenda, the perspective of the Pharisees. So they're going to go a little different route to get their argument made. This is what happens next. Verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he'd been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who received his sight and asked them, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see? What are they doing? They're trying to change the argument. Well, okay, we know he sees, but was he ever really blind? Right? If he was never blind, no miracle. And Jesus is still a sinner. So to make the argument, to go backwards and say, let's prove he was never blind in the first place. So they get the parents, bring the parents in. Is this guy blind or not? Now the parents, by the way, you got to wonder, where were they when this guy was out begging? Well, they're not as courageous to tell the truth as their son necessarily. Look what happens here next. Verse 20. His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah will be put out of the synagogue. Wow. His parents threw him under the bus. Right? This is the opposite of the woman we saw last week, the Canaanite woman who stood up for her daughter. Remember that? The great mom? These are the opposite. They're like, hey, just ask him. We don't want any part of this. Right? We don't want to stand up for him. We're not excited for him. Whatever. Just leave us out of it. That's hard. And poor Fred's like, what's going on? Now, by the way, let's take a step back. Jesus said that this guy was born blind for God's work to be revealed, right? How's it going to happen? Because so far in this guy's life, he's been born blind, into darkness, isolated, alone, a beggar, background noise, people asking, did he sin or his parents sin? Now, he's brought before the religious leaders, badgered. His parents have thrown him under the bus, backed off him, and he's standing there alone. How in the world is God going to reveal his works through this situation? But verse 24, these guys don't give up. So for the second time, they called the man who had been born blind, and they said to Fred, "Give glory to God. We know this man's a sinner." What they're saying here, this little phrase, "give glory to God," is what you would say to somebody in the ancient world that you knew was guilty. It's kind of like, look, dude, just confess. We know you're guilty. We saw you do it. Just confess, and we'll go easy on you. So what you're saying is, we know you're lying to us. Either you weren't born blind, or this Jesus didn't do it, something else happened. Tell us the truth, because we know that this Jesus is a sinner. Change your story. Verse 25. He answered, "I do not know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see." Not disrespectful, not angry. He just calls and says, look, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. I don't know the guy. What I do know is he healed me. That's all I know. And then in verse 26 he says, or they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" Because they're looking for that whole working on Sabbath thing to nail Jesus, right? Fred answered them, "I have already told you, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to be his disciples?" Really kind of spunky kind of guy, right? I love this. But, here's the thing. That question he asks there, why do you want to know? Do you want to be his disciples? Is actually the heart of the question. That's the heart of what's going on. Why do you want to know? Because look, if I was healed, you got a choice to make. You have a choice to make. Isaiah said, as a prophet, a long time ago, that when Messiah comes, the blind will see, the deaf will hear. Well, I can see. So they have a choice to make. Are they going to stick to their way of seeing the world, their assumption, their perspective, or allow this blind man to change how they see the world? So why, he says, do you ask me? I've told you. Do you want to follow him or not? Which is kind of the question they get to. And that question, that mirror into their soul works. Verse 28, then they reviled him. They're angry with him. They get mad, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, Here's an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but that he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has there been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So look at the evidence. I can see. I couldn't, now I can. This guy's from God. And that took faith. That took courage, because we've already seen the pressure he's under, the pressure his parents are under. And yet, this guy just tells his story. And in verse 34, we get what we expect from the Pharisees. They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Just quit listening. We're done. Get out. You don't fit our model. You don't fit our agenda. You don't fit our perspective. Get out. And the conversation stops. This happens a lot today, doesn't it? We just quit listening. We're done. And that happens here in this story here. And now we're left with this guy alone. Again. Right? Born blind. A beggar. Parents gone. See ya. His town, sees his background noise. Jesus himself, by the way, could have healed him on Monday, but he didn't. Jesus healed him on a Sabbath and then left. And now here he is, kicked out of the synagogue. I mean, how much worse can it get for this guy? But then something amazing happens. The best part of the story. Because again, we're asking the question, how is God going to reveal his works through this guy? In the next verse it says this: Jesus heard that they'd driven him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have already seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." How is God's work revealed in this guy? Not through the miracle, but through this guy's faith. This guy simply stood there and told the story. He didn't have all the information at all. Not until at the very end he does, but he just tells a story. He is courageous and he's faithful to what God has done in his life and tells that story. That's it. He's faithful. I think that is how God's work is revealed in him. Despite the suffering and the loss, the anger at him, the being reviled and excluded and ignored, despite all of that, he clings to the story of God working in his life. And here's the coolest part back in verse 35. Jesus went looking for him. Isn't that cool? We don't hear that very often, that Jesus goes looking for people. People look for Jesus, but he goes looking for this guy. When he's alone and isolated, kicked out, ignored, Jesus goes and finds him. That's us sometimes. Sometimes we feel like this guy. We feel isolated, ignored. We don't have all the answers, alone. Jesus is going to come looking for you. He does come looking for you and for me. He's not looking for people to be great theologians or to have all the answers or know the Bible backwards and forwards. What he's looking for are people to simply to tell their story of how God has worked and continues to work in their lives. To tell your story. That's what he's looking for. That's all this guy did. I was blind, but now I see. That's my story. And Jesus did that. What's your story? Tell your story. Live your story. And know that Jesus is going to find you. Let's pray together.